good.
Yeah, perfect.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm gonna kind of go through this, basically just giving a presentation on kind of what we do at Nori, how the whole marketplace works, how we use blockchain. I'll tie that in there at some points, and I will also I'm kind of doing this a little bit different style than I usually do when I give this type of presentation. We'll probably go about 15 minutes or 20 minutes into it, and I might switch over to a live demo because I'm feeling lucky today. We'll see what happens. Then I'll probably kind of switch back to the rest of the presentation and then kind of open it up for any kind of Q&A and discussion around either what we do at Nori, what it's like, working on blockchain projects in the workplace, and or any other experience type stuff that I've been through here. So at Nori, my role is my official title is Principal Blockchain Architect, which was something that was fancy and meant something probably when we started the company. Probably means much less now, now that we're kind of further into the company. Really, you can think of my role at Nori as leading up the engineering side. We have a pretty small team. There's about there's 11 of us right now, and we're growing. And the product side of our company is only actually 4 people large, and 2 of which are engineers, and the other 2 are designers or designer-esque. So kind of who we are, kind of talking about the different backgrounds that we've got. There's some of us that are environmentalists. There's one of us that's got a background in economics. A few of us, the 2 designers that are on the product team, are designers. There's 2 software engineers, but we're all kind of entrepreneurs and work closely with a lot of academics. A lot of our advisory board and partners have academic backgrounds. So we kind of started this company. Shoot, how long ago was that now? Maybe coming up on 3 years, I think. We started this company as a small team of 7. Or actually, really, it was about 6 of us initially, or maybe even 5, when we started this idea out of a hackathon that was just actually way back when. It started with just Paul and I. Paul is the CEO of Nori, and we started with this idea that we wanted to. We participated in a hackathon for a project, or that was hosted by a project called Protocol Labs / IPFS and the MetaMask team, which is an Ethereum wallet project. And we started with this idea, and we called it Carbon Harvest. There's some ghost repository on GitHub somewhere with some of the basic ideas in there, but we were very naive, took a very naive stab at what it would mean to try and build out some kind of crypto economic platform where farmers could get paid for pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it in soil. And so that was the kind of or at least that was my origin with Nori, and we kind of grew from there, and a few others started to get involved. So Christoph Jaspe is one of my other co-founders who was connected with Paul, and they actually are the official 2 first that were actually part of Nori as they started to sprawl out and or span out and try to kind of recruit the rest of us. And kind of a cool, interesting story of growth there. But the next kind of phase of Nori was the 5, or there were 6 of us, but one of those people never actually went on to help build Nori. But there were 6 of us, and we participated in a hackathon that was then hosted by Microsoft and Consensus, kind of like a joint hackathon called the Blockchain for Social Impact Challenge, I believe. And we kind of came up with a second rendition of what Paul and I set out to do in that first hackathon, but did not have nearly enough time or thought or plethora of experience between individuals to pull off. And we called that project Giagora, which then eventually turned into be Nori. After we kind of took we took the winning place in that hackathon, and we're like used it as a means to kind of feel out like how it would be to work with each other as co-founders. And it was a great experience, and we all kind of enjoyed each other. We all, obviously did well in that hackathon to where we could take, first place. And we then immediately just kind of set out to start Nori. One of the things even that we did as part of that hackathon was we created a podcast for, we created a podcast episode. Effectively, it was our what then turned into be the Reversing Climate Change podcast, which is now, I don't know, about 100 plus episodes. With I think I don't know what the latest numbers are, but they get about 5,000 weekly downloads, and it's fairly successful for the climate category, which is kind of a newer or smaller category for environmental podcasts, and seems to be doing pretty well. But during that hackathon, we created that pilot episode, and that was kind of an interesting way to start a company, is to start a podcast and use that as a means to not only broaden your understanding by interviewing and people with significantly more environmental experience, but also a good way to kind of document how you evolve and change as a company through the time. It'd be real interesting, even if I were to go back and listen to all those episodes, you would definitely see how Nori kind of changed or pivots from episode to episode, just as both from our belief systems, but also just like the way that we would build product or give updates, skewed from one direction to another. Anyway, that was a long-winded way of saying we are Nori, and we are a bunch of people who sort of know what we're doing, but when we don't know what we're doing, we reach out to the right people. To step back and then talk a little bit about, because I'm realizing now I haven't really talked about what Nori is. Nori is a marketplace for carbon removal. So we deal strictly with carbon that's being removed from the atmosphere, CO2. And we then create a marketplace around people who are wanting to offset or remove their carbon footprint. And so we launched this marketplace at the end of, or at the beginning, it was really at the end of 2020 and, the end of 2019. And we're still kind of working to grow that marketplace and grow the vision or the grander design. When we launched our marketplace, we started with about 10,000 tons or so of CO2 removed with one of our pilot farmers called Trey, who was who was basically performing certain types of regenerative agricultural practices. And we let him, kind of be our pilot or our first to be able to get paid as a farmer directly through the Nori marketplace. So, each ton was sold for about $15 a ton, which meant that this farmer has been paid over $100,000 just from performing the regenerative practices and pledging effectively to or pledging to prove that he will continue to store CO2 or continue to draw down CO2 into the soils that are part of his regular crop practices. And so that's kind of a high level overview of what we did. As we move into the rest of the 2020, so to back up there, we did eventually sell out of those tons that Trey had provided us. And so now going through the rest of 2020, we're trying to scale out our marketplace and figure out what we want to kind of do longer term, or how we want to kind of operate and what our grander vision is. And I'll kind of get a little bit into that as we kind of progress through these slides here. So what Nori is, it's a marketplace. We deal strictly with carbon removal. So that means carbon that was stored or removed from the atmosphere, and not carbon that was or carbon emissions that were avoided. So there's effectively two types of, you can think of carbon offsets or the carbon market as effectively having two types of commodities that you deal with. One is typically in emission avoidance. So that's like if you're creating some kind of emissions and you're implementing some kind of procedure or technology that would allow whatever emissions that you create or produce to be, let's say, halved. So that's about avoiding emissions. And then the alternative to that, and what we deal strictly with, is carbon that's removed. So carbon that is not only not created in addition, but is actually pulled or sucked down from the stock that is available in the environment, and storing that into products or soils or environments. And what also we are not is we're not a broker of projects. We're effectively, we do the matchmaking process between, or we allow for a marketplace to be created between independent farmers and independent buyers. And then we kind of take a transaction fee out of the middle of there. But we don't actually broker the projects themselves. And we do not ourselves also provide offsets or credits. These are two individual things that are happening, and then we kind of sit in the middle. So when you look at the problems that Nori addresses, we kind of if you look at what the bigger picture with climate change is today, you effectively can see that no matter how much you were to reduce, and if you look at that, look at this in terms of like the kind of global picture of emissions and how these things affect the life cycle of the world. Emission reductions are simply not enough. You cannot achieve some of the goals that are like subscribed, or some of the goals that have been prescribed for us in order to kind of start to reverse the more significant downsides of climate change. And so, in order for us to achieve those things, you would actually have to actually deal with carbon being removed, or it's simply just not enough. So our kind of motto is emit less and remove the rest. After you have reduced emissions, the only way to truly like negate your footprint is to remove as much of the carbon as you've emitted. So it's kind of like you do still need to reduce emissions, but you also need to do this thing in addition, which is you need to deal strictly with the removal of CO2. So if you want to, if you look at this picture here, you can kind of see like the comparison in a general way of the differences between the types of environmental commodities. And the first thing you see here, basically, if you've got this amount that you're providing in terms of like your footprint, how much you're providing as part of like the global footprint, you've got this amount of CO2 that's produced from your everyday operation. And then there are things that you can do, like you can do offsetting with energy efficiency credits, or you could do offsetting with renewable energy credits. But effectively, all you're able to do with like energy efficiency is like you can reduce emissions, and all you can really do with renewable energy credits is you can maybe bring that down to zero, so long as like your energy kind of storage and transmission doesn't also create CO2 emissions. You can bring that down to net zero. But only with carbon removal can you take that even further and actually get into the negative emission kind of area, where you're not only not producing some, but you can actually remove others. So now kind of jumping into how Nori works, I'll kind of give a little overview here on the different parties that are participating in the marketplace. So Nori is like a two-sided marketplace where we deal with both the supplier and the demand side of a marketplace. But breaking that down, we actually have at least 4 categories of participants inside of Nori. Firstly, you have suppliers. So you have people in the world who are removing CO2 from the atmosphere. You have farmers who are, performing things like regenerative agriculture, which are things like making sure that taking care of the soil in a way that allows or improves the way that CO2 can be stored directly in that soil. You have other things that are even more direct. You have like industrial approaches to it, where you've got something called direct air capture, which is imagine like this big vacuum that's sucking in CO2 directly from the atmosphere, which is a much more direct approach. However, the cost for actually performing that efficiently is so significantly high still that we probably won't see this for quite some time in any kind of mass produced way. At least not that is efficient. However, there are some fantastic new technologies that are working and striving to do those things. Then you have, inside of our ecosystem, you have quantifiers. So you have ways to model the CO2 that's being removed from the atmosphere when we deal with soil carbon. So that's like regenerative practices that I've been talking about. We partnered with an academic company out of Colorado State University who called Comet Farm, which provides us a layer of quantification that allows us to detect or project the amount of CO2 that's being removed historically and through the future as a model. And the way that works is like we collect all kinds of data inside of our platform, inside of the Nori platform, through suppliers, through farmers. And then we send that off to our quantifier partner, which is Comet. And then they can send us back effectively the numbers after running this through models and simulations of the soil carbon life cycle. And then we kind of get back like the approximate carbon that would be stored in soil that had performed historically those practices, as well as will perform some number of practices in the future. So that's the quantifiers. Then there's the verifiers. There are you kind of have this issue in a carbon market, especially when you're dealing with models and simulations, as well as like independent data collection and data submission, where you need a third party, an independent third party, to come in and be able to verify or attest to the legitimacy of the data that was submitted to our quantifier. So this is like there are people in traditional carbon markets who do this for offset markets, for instance, who can look at data sets or talk to the suppliers of the CO2 removed and kind of attest or stamp their approval as to whether the data that was submitted was true or not. And so this is entirely independent of Nori. We do not provide this. Rather, what we do inside of our platform is we provide the interfaces that can help with the matchmaking process between suppliers and verifiers, so that they can link themselves up and then get whatever attestation onto that data set or output that they created. Finally, you have buyers, and this is basically anyone who wants to pay for CO2, the CO2 removal to negate emissions. So most frequently, this is like large corporate buyers where you have a branch of corporate social responsibility inside of a larger corporation who is responsible for removing or negating some amount of emissions. And to do that, they go off and they purchase offsets, or in our case, carbon removed. And to think of an example, you think of like Microsoft's like pledge for I think their most recent pledge was actually for negative emissions, but up until this year, it was mostly just to deal with negating Microsoft's emissions. And so, in order to do that, they then have to employ these individuals who then go seek out the offsets and do all of the work required to actually making that a thing. Otherwise, it's empty and it's just a promise. Then you also have like Stripe, who committed, I don't remember how much money it was, but they committed a whole bunch of money that they wanted to remove some amount of carbon. And so they're also, they kind of led a waterfall of additional companies who kind of followed suit. I think Shopify followed suit, and a whole bunch of others who are kind of trying to do the same thing. And so what Nori is it's effectively the marketplace that allows for those people to meet those goals. I kind of already broke these down, but to give a little bit more overview of what suppliers do, typically they're growers. They've adopted practices that are proven to remove additional CO2 from the atmosphere, and then store it in the soil as carbon. Some of the practices, for example, might include like no-till planting, planting cover crops, or performing different types of crop rotations that improve the health of the soil. In that supplier's journey, effectively what happens is after the supplier goes through the application and submits the data and gets their quantification, Nori then issues, and as well as paid for the third-party verification to create these things called Nori removal tons. We then issue a certificate to the supplier. And to bring this kind of back to the topic of this meetup, which is a desert blockchain, it's about blockchain. One of the things that we do here in this process is we stamp that data onto the blockchain as this permanent record of, or attestation of, something that happened and something that is true and rooted in reality. But we do that into some kind of permanent data structure, which is the blockchain, the Ethereum blockchain in this case. And so one interesting kind of artifact from that is the fact that we always want our buyers, when they are purchasing things through us, to have some kind of permanent record some kind of thing that is theirs entirely for from now until the end of time. And one of the interesting things that the blockchain provides us is this ability that any company that stands up a product today who issues whatever digital product they might have, um, there's always the chance that that company effectively goes away at some point. And when that happens, if you've got some kind of digital product, that digital product, if it's hosted in some kind of centralized server, some kind of centralized infrastructure or whatever, as soon as that company's gone, your digital product is gone as well. And so this interesting kind of world that the blockchain opens is even if the company goes away, you've still got your digital product and you have the proof and you have this kind of ownership of that thing from now until the end of the time because it's on the blockchain and it's effectively yours. You can prove that with private keys, etc. Um, and so anyway, that's kind of I'll kind of delve a little bit more into that later, but that's kind of the high level overview of what we kind of issue these farmers as for their data for the carbon removed. And once it's been verified, we issue those on the blockchain as what we call internally as like issuances, which then can be purchased from buyers. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but in addition to the thing that I was just talking about with the blockchain, and another kind of interesting thing that happens, one of the original problems that blockchain was trying to solve was the double spend problem. And I won't go too deep into this because it could definitely derail me, but one of the issues that traditional carbon markets to date had was the issue of double counting. And what that means is you have offsets that are being sold or whatever being sold in one market and then effectively resold in another market. And you have this kind of, if you do if an accountant comes to look at it, they look at all the offsets that were sold, and then you're kind of actually, you're coming up with some false number related to the size or the impact of the carbon markets. And you have people reselling the same thing where that effectively makes the asset or the commodity that's being traded or sold, eventually empty and not worth actually anything. And so one of the interesting aspects about putting it on the blockchain is you can kind of remove that double counting problem in the same way that you remove the double spending problem with Bitcoin or any blockchain really. Going into the quantifiers, I talked about this a bit, but just to touch on it again, Nori we have partnered with Comet Farm, which is a USDA funded tool based out of Colorado State, and they provide us all of the carbon stock changes or the modeling in order for us to model or to project any individual farmer's soil carbon stock. So they estimate this. The way that this works is effectively they've got soil maps across the U.S. and those soil maps can tell you, the health of the soil distributed across some geographic area. And then they also consider things like weather history and different land management kind of aspects to the geographic regions. And the way that this works is effectively a farmer comes in and they have to submit like 20 years of historical data. They have to submit like, what crop was grown where, what was the fertilizer that was used, how much fertilizer was used, what types of tillage did you use, what was your irrigation practice, things along these lines. And they need that for 20 historical years. And then in addition to that, you need 10 years of like projected, like what is your plan going to be going forward? And once you take that kind of bundle of time or bundle of data, you then also take the geographic region which this happens. So like some kind of geospatial, parcel on a map, couple those together, send it off to Comet Farm. Comet Farm runs it through this Monte Carlo simulation and runs this model like thousands of times with all these different variables. And out they can spit this kind of a very detailed, very scientific data set that tells you kind of all of the attributes that you need to quantify the carbon stock of any given plot of soil. Now going into that verifier thing again, these are independent, professionals. I won't actually talk too much more about this because I already talked about it. But we provide, kind of the interface for the matchmaking there between suppliers and the verifiers. And then the buyers here, I already talked about this one. So the uh, in this marketplace, you've effectively got these suppliers that are performing these practices and are able to create those NRTs that can then be sold to buyers. And so, in the larger picture, I sort of gave some background to this in the very beginning, where I was talking about how there are ways to deal with carbon removed in terms of like soil, in terms of croplands, but there are other ways to do this as well. There's grazing lands. There's how did you manage cattle through certain area that certain types of grazing practices effectively can also produce carbon removed. Then there's direct air capture and other industrial things like that. But there's really a plethora of ways that you can actually remove and store carbon into not just soil, but also consumer products like carpets, like shoes, like all kinds of different things. And so the effective process, now zooming back out, is if you look at it at a high level, because now I'm going to effectively break down each of the steps here. But CO2 is removed from the supplier. The removal is then verified by some independent verifier. We then issue a certificate for that removal on the blockchain and inside of our application. And then once that certificate is sold, it's then effectively retired. And I didn't touch too much on that, but this kind of goes back to the double counting problem of people being able to resell certificates of offsets or whatnot, but or strictly in our marketplace, we use the blockchain as a way to forcefully prevent double counting and double selling of these things by using a smart contract that effectively will lock the certificate. It will be non-transferable after it's been traded once. So once that happens, it's effectively permanently locked and solidified in the blockchain, and there's nothing you can do to undo that action. And then, so kind of going back into the data requirements, what might actually be more interesting here now, I think I'm at a point now where we could switch into a demo of the product instead of going through these slides. So I'll do that now. Let me see if I've still got it open here. Can you all see can you see the application, the projects here?
Yeah, I see.
Great. So what I'll do here, so this is what you're seeing here is, I might just refresh this because I might need to relog in. So what you see here is effectively the suppliers, what a farmer would see after they have created an account and signed in. And so right now you can see a bunch of the projects that I've previously created, but I'll go through the process of, imagine this is a blank slate and we have nothing here. The first step would be to create a new project. And this term project is a way of thinking of any collection of fields, boundaries, farms that are under a single owner. And so I'll do that here. I'll call this, let's say, Pumpkin Pines. And I'll click add. And what this is going to do is create a workspace for adding additional fields inside of the application. So the first thing I can do is I can add a field set. And I'm going to go ahead and just use the demo data set. And I'll call this, field 1 inside of my farm. And what this is effectively going to do is it's going to create a data set that could then be edited by the farmer. However, because I use the example data set, we can kind of open that up and look at the kind of stuff that gets populated in here, because that'll be easier to talk about, like what is the actual data needed. So as I said, you need about 20, you need data going back about 20 years and 10 years into the future. And so what data that is it's things like what crop did you grow in this area? What date was it planted? What date did you harvest? What was the yield for that crop? And all of this other kind of information regarding like the crop and the harvest. You then also need like tillage information. You need fertilizer information. you need information about your organic matter or your manure, irrigation, liming, and then information about grazing and whether or not you burned your fields, which is not so common in the US. Then you have all of this information that's effectively collected. We can then take that data and send that off to our partners at Comet Farm, which can then send us back. It takes, I think this data set should only take about a minute to run, but after it runs, it looks like there might be a little issue, but I can go to another project which had already completed the projection, same data set here. So inside of that, after you click that button, it sends it off to Comet Farm. Comet Farm comes back with us with this, number of tons that would be removed given those practices. And so given the example data set, what you kind of see is that over the course of 10 years, that field will remove 1,585 tons of CO2. You can then kind of start plugging in those numbers into a calculator here. So one interesting thing is, like, we started with a pretty small field relative to lots of the fields that we deal with. I think the tray had about 10,000 acres of fields. So you can say, okay, if I'm going to come at you with 10,000 acres of croplands, and then I'm going to say, okay, if the price of a ton removed or sold is $15, let's say I spend $10,000 in verification, as well as this or registration rather. Let's do $1,000 registration or verification registration. Let's do 3,000 there and a final audit cost of, let's say, I don't know, $5,000. Actually, I'll make that a little higher. And then you say, okay, well, in order to perform the things that I said that I was going to do going into the future for 10 years, I'm going to say, like, okay, maybe there's $15,000 I had to spend to do whatever kind of operation expenditures in order to make that happen. Maybe there was an additional $5,000 to labor costs, et cetera, et cetera. And what you can kind of see is, like, okay, well, given this type of field, well, over the next 10 years, that could be $2 million according to this, which is quite large. But again, that's 10,000 acres of croplands, and that's also it's not $2 million up front. It's every year they have to submit additional data in order to prove that they're still performing those practices and are qualified for earning that type of money. And so Trey, for instance, got the $100,000 for that first year, or the grandfathered first couple of years, but through time, depending on what his practices were for those different fields, he may make whatever type of money here that happens. And one other important bit here is that the cost of the NRT here is being fixed at $15 because that's what we did for our first sale. But going into the future, this price will actually be set by a mechanism called forward contract auctions, which will kind of works similar to futures, but it have some very important distinctions, where you'll kind of like be able to just see be able to trade these forward contracts in order to figure out what the true price of carbon is. However, for us, in order for us to kind of test the waters, we set the floor price or the absolute price of a ton removed at $15, just to kind of get a baseline so that we could go through the sale without having to build out the whole forward contract kind of mechanisms, because it becomes very complex very quickly there. And so anyway, you can kind of get all those estimates. Then you are effectively in your sort of last phase, where you're in this verification phase, where you can then select a verifier. That verifier can then log in and verify all of the data and attest whether or not it's true. And then effectively what you've got at the very end is you kind of end up with my thing's in the way. If you go to Nori.com, you can see kind of what this looks like for the buyer's perspective. But once in fact, I'll start here. This is the public profile, and this is public URL, so anyone can actually go here. But you can see Trey Hill's public profile here of all of the things that happened. You know, we issued 14,000 tons. We reserved internally 6,000 of those for some individual fields.
And I'm not sure. We're not on the same screen as what you're looking
I think
at.
I'm on a different screen. We see your Google's.
We just see a
What
blank.
do you see?
Oh,
Google
it paused.
search
How
bar.
about now?
There we go.
Okay. To back up, you know, this was the buyer thing that I was saying. Like, if you were a buyer, you know, you could come here. You could say, I want to purchase. You know, let's just use an actual example. So I can go like, if I want to offset my flight for one passenger for like a 1 to 6 hour flight, I can then say, okay, that's approximately equal to 1 ton of CO2 emitted. I can then click this remove carbon button, which will then take me to a checkout page. Now, because we reserved, you know, the 6,000 that I was mentioning, we currently are only like accepting back orders because the rest of the supply from Trey is effectively reserved. But typically you would get this certificate that would be then, which looks effectively something like this. And I'll show you in a minute, where you've got this attestation. You've also got a link to the blockchain, and you can kind of see all of the data there tied to it. As well as you can kind of get the whole, you get the picture of what you're purchasing ahead of time by looking at the current, you know, next in line supplier, and you get all the information regarding his actual practices. You get the verification attestation report, so you can see exactly what types of verification the verifier signed off on, and you can see all of the different fields that were creating these, you know, tons removed in soil. You can also see a link to our public methodology thing, which breaks down in high detail how exactly we do the quantification and what the actual process looks like, and what exactly, you know, what is the thing that backs the processes, or, you know, is providing these things called NRTs, and which is peer reviewed by a large group of academics and scientists, as well as like with our partners like at Comet Farm and others. And so that's effectively what you get there. When you kind of come out the reverse end of that, from the buyer's perspective, you get this certificate, and you get a public profile here as well with that. And inside of this profile, you've effectively got, at the high level, you've got our first purchaser, which was from a company called Boots and All Travel, good now friend of Nori, who paid, you know, the supplier, which we just showed, was Trey Hill's or his farm called company called Harborview Farms, for 454.55 tons of CO2 removed. And you kind of get the sign off here. You get this fancy serial number, as well as you kind of get this profile of like, here's a breakdown of this person's removals for this given certificate. And then that final last part you kind of see is all of the details relating to the attestation, or the you know, permanence that we create then on the blockchain. And so you can kind of see this on Etherscan. You can see all of the kind of data here. You can kind of see the attestation data as well here as the serial number that kind of links back and forth. You can even see, you know, all of the certificates of carbon removal that we've issued. You know, this is effectively how the blockchain works. You get the whole kind of picture, and it's in a permanent picture. So that's effectively the end then of the buyer's journey. So going back to the presentation, well, quick time check. It's 7:47 now. I've given more or less a high overview here on what Nori is and kind of where we're at. Maybe I'll spend 3 more minutes talking about where we're going, and then spend the last 10 minutes on just opening the floor for any kind of questions or discussion. I know Jay had a couple things he wanted to ask. So going forward,
we do have some questions from the YouTube live stream as well.
Okay,
so go ahead.
Cool. Yeah, so real quick, you know, going forward, we're about to scale up. We're hiring, you know, we're hiring a PM, a product owner, another engineer, We just hired some other people. We're trying to grow to about like 20 people or so. Right now we're at 11, I think. And, growing to 20 is kind of our next phase over the next, however long. And then one of the things that we're trying to do next in terms of our goals is one of the issues that we've had on the supply side, and the supply innovation that we're trying to kind of conquer right now is something called proxy baselines. At least it's called that internally. And what this means is the issue that we have with suppliers for scale is that that suppliers need to come in with 20 years of historical data with like this very intimate detail set, which they may or may not have, in most cases don't have. And a limitation of Comet Farm is that it requires that much data. It can't work without that much data. And so what we've had to do is create some kind of way to access various public data sets out there, does crawling, and gets all the information for a given geographic region, and then provides like a proxy of the data. And then we can kind of flip the problem on its head and say, well, instead of you just giving us all the data, we can just say, okay, here's the data that we kind of gathered for your geographic region. Tell us where we went wrong. And then we can kind of go from there and apply types of penalties if they can't prove that these things happened in terms of their payout. That's the supply. That's where we're going with the supply. From the demand side, we created this effective spot market where you're paying $15, and that money goes to Trey, and we take a transaction fee on top of that from the buyer. But in the future, as we go forward, we want to do two main things really. Number one is we want to eventually have that forward contract auction dynamic or mechanism so that we can kind of have true price discovery around the price of carbon. And then another big thing is actually building out something called, or that we like to say is the API for reversing climate change. So we want this to be, rather than you coming to the Nori marketplace, we want this to be kind of ingrained in everyday living, where let's say you get to the end of your Lyft, you take Uber or Lyft, and the screen pops up and says, hey, your ride today was offset, brought to you by Coca-Cola, and a little API goes off and pulls from Coca-Cola's funds and pays the farmer, and effectively is just kind of starting to become ingrained in your everyday operation. Or let's say you're at the individual level and it's not operating through that. Let's say you go to your Amazon purchase, you get to the checkout, and you could click a little box that says, hey, do you want to offset the cost of producing this good? So I'll stop there and pause there and kind of transition over to questions.
Cool. That's really awesome. Thank you, Jaycen. So Jim, Chad, any questions? And you're both on mute, by the way. You'll have to unmute if you want to ask a question.
It also looks like, did my video stop, or do you all have a black screen?
I was having some internet issues, so I'm not sure.
Right now,
yeah, in order to avoid having to restart Zoom 100 times again, I'm just going to leave it as is. So apologies for no video at this last 10 minutes.
No problem. Go ahead, Jim. Do you have a question?
Hey, Jaycen, can you explain more on what motivates the buyer?
Yeah, so typically what we've seen currently is that you've got a buyer, let's use the Microsoft example, where you've got a pledge of where the company wants to achieve net zero emissions, and they want to use that as a way to say like, hey, we're a company of good, right? We're someone who cares about the world and the users, and that company will then need to, they can't just say that and then not do it or not provide on it. Otherwise it's, that would be very kind of just strange. It wouldn't make any sense for them to say they want to do that thing and then not do that. And so that is kind of what happens at the larger corporate side of things. And so sometimes that pressure comes from even like, shareholders. I can't remember the name of the group that recently went to some of these larger companies and said, hey, we're going to dump all the stock if you don't make some impact on take climate change seriously and help the world. And so sometimes that comes from pressures like shareholders, but at an individual level, it also comes from people who just, individually care about the climate or care about the impacts of climate change. And so they want to be able to do things that are above and beyond things like offsetting. And so, or that could come from, sometimes people will make donations to other charities, for instance, as like a gift. And so through our application, you can also do this thing where you're like doing good on behalf of another person as like a gift for that person. And then you also have, like, going back one more time to the corporate side where I was using that, where I gave that example of Lyft. Like, if let's say you get to the end of this Lyft ride and it says like, hey, your ride was offset today by Coca-Cola. It kind of like gives you that feeling inside where it's like, okay, well, this Coca-Cola just made me feel good. And it's effectively a medium for advertising, really. But it's just another way to kind of think about the motivations of why somebody might purchase these things.
Jim,
Does this tie back?
Jim, what Jaycen just told you is that for this Christmas, Jaycen is going to give me a lump of coal in my stocking.
That's right. Some raw carbon.
Does this tie back to the?
I'm sorry,
Does this tie back to the United Nations criteria they set forth for being more environmentally minded and social and so on?
I think what you're referring to is the IPCC Paris Climate Accord stuff.
It may be, because the other thing I was wondering is bigger companies are looking for investors and they have to show that kind of governance. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so it does in some way go back to that. I think, effectively what was the output of that report is that, here it was basically an assessment of like, here's how bad things are going to get and here's how long you have to address them if you don't achieve those things. And Nori was not a reaction to that. However, because I believe that actually started to happen, I don't know, about a year and a half ago, which we've been kind of around for 3 years, but we kind of had a jump start of just wanting
Jaycen,
to build
we lost you. Sorry.
Oh, can you hear me? Can you all hear me?
I can hear you, Jaycen.
Oh, so maybe just Jay might have lost me.
Yeah,
Okay. So effectively, we kind of wanted to build out a voluntary market. We looked at how carbon markets work today and wanted to kind of take a different stab at it. If you look at traditional markets, you've got top-down markets, which are kind of organized or created inside of like governments. And you've got these governments then handing down this criteria to emitters that says like, here's the cap you've got. And if you can't meet that cap, you've got to pay a penalty or you've got to trade for the rights to emit, which has all kinds of a slew of problems. It's, look at it whichever way you want. But if you look at, kind of how these marketplaces played out, most of them have crashed and the ones that haven't crashed will crash. For reasons kind of outlined with like the double spend problem, but also through a various slew of other types of ways to kind of game the traditional carbon markets, of which I usually include in the presentation, but kind of left out here. But anyway, Nori wanted to kind of address this from a bottom up thing and say, hey, let's build a voluntary market. We don't want anyone kind of coming to this as as a means to just like meet some kind of top down regulation. We want, if you really want to meet, your investors' needs, or if you want to create some kind of advertisement or feel good kind of market movement, or if you're an individual, like we should just remove that entry to barrier, number one. And number two, like this should be totally voluntary and we'll see how it works. Let's let the market decide kind of thing.
All right. Chad, did you have any questions? We got some questions from the live stream, the YouTube.
No, I don't have any right now.
Okay, Jim, did that cover your questions? Okay, hopefully. So from the live stream, Jaycen, the questions were, how do you verify the data users input in that spreadsheet? And then a follow-up was, especially from 20 years ago, And then there was another comment that said, seems like that could be a big barrier from using the platform, especially if the farmer hasn't owned the land that long. And I think you already touched upon that, but anything else you would add?
Yeah, sort of. So the couple points that I touched on were, number one, how do you like verify that data? There are different ways to do that. So number one, obviously they hire an independent verifier through the platform. That independent verifier then works with the supplier to make sure that those things happened. Now, how a verifier does that is a continuously evolving process at this point because of how many approaches effectively there are to that, and you have to keep costs low. And most of this, by the way, is also outlined in the methodology thing that I sort of link to, or if you didn't see it, you can go to nori.com/certificate/1 and click the version 1.1 methodology link. But the gist is like there are ways to prove that thing happened. So you can look at the farmer's sales of the crop to whoever that person distributes the food through. You can look at you can take soil surveys of the actual soil, and you can prove that the carbon happened if you don't even want to look at the data and you actually just want to look raw at the number that was produced. You can actually take a sample of the soil and prove that that soil is currently storing the amount that was projected or modeled rather. And then the other way kind of slides into that second comment there, which was like looking at the 20 years of historical data. That sounds like it's a lot or hard to do, especially if they don't have that data or didn't own that land. Is this thing that I started to touch on, which was called the proxy baselines, which looks at public data sets and crawls them and parses them for the information that we need. And some of these data sets are very robust, highly accurate. And even when they're not accurate, give us a level of uncertainty back, like an actual mathematical uncertainty, how likely was this to have happened? But it's often very accurate, mainly because of the reason of, the way it kind of works is like, hey, we can look at records in these public data sets. And if you lived near someone that we've surveyed who grew corn and you're this person's neighbor, chances are you grew corn too, because that's how, like, if you look at like the regions at which you grow certain crops, like typical crops happen in typical areas because they're more conducive to growing that type of crop in that area. And so to circle it back, it's you use approaches like that. You use like these uncertainty things. You also compare them to public data sets. And then anytime something looks way off, that's where the verifier steps in and asserts their effective. And Jay often likes to talk about identity, but this is where they're effectively staking the verifier's identity of whether or not, or using their identity to, attest something, risking possibly their reputation.
Cool. One last question. We are over time by a minute, but we'll extend this another 5 minutes or so. How much, what's the volume of transactions Nori's done so far in US dollars?
So it's some number, I don't know the exact number, but it's over $100,000. But most of that was done over the course of like 2 months, I think. Where we started our sale, did the whole promotion thing. I think we started in late October and ended just around the first of the year, some point, first week of, I don't know, some early week in January. And we effectively sold out during that time because we reserved the 6,000 aside specifically so that we could still continue to run proof of concepts with some of these larger corporations to trial out that thing which I alluded to, which was the API for reversing climate change. We needed to have some kind of stock in order for us to trial that. And so we set it aside and then started to take only back orders, at which point we'd no longer charge for the card, and we charge them at some future date when there's stock available for them to purchase.
Okay, cool. Well, that's pretty much the time that we have. And I think that was an awesome presentation, Jaycen. Again, thank you for the presentation. Thank you for this incredibly innovative approach to climate change and carbon removal. It's very, very inspiring. It's been very inspiring for me to see the path that Nori's taken, the contribution that you've made to Nori, and just an incredibly innovative project that's decentralized as well as making an impact in many dimensions. So that's the end of our session for tonight. Next month, we're going to have ZoroSign, and we'll be talking about digital signatures, digital documentation that can be managed on blockchain. So thank you very much, and look forward to you participating in next month's events and any future events. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thanks a lot, Jay. Thanks, Jaycen.
Yep.
Yeah.
See y'all later.
Yep. Thank you, Jaycen.